Happy New Year. Thanks for joining Real Story Group's first webinar of 2026. And it's a really interesting one that we're excited to talk with you about today. We're going to focus on marketing automation platforms, email service providers, and whether this is the right time to consider alternative options out there. So Tony's going to take us through the meat of today's presentation, but I just want to introduce myself briefly. I'm Scott Dill on the business development team here at Real Story Group, and it's exciting to see so many folks joining us for today's session. As always, you will get a copy of these slides after today's session, so keep an eye out from an email from our marketing team for that. And we'll have some time at the end for questions. So you'll see in the GoToWebinar control panel, you can click on the questions tab, and you're welcome to send any questions, feedback, anecdotes you'd like to share, and we'll get to those at the end of today's session. So just brief overview of Real Story Group. I see several new folks online with us here today, and just want to give a quick look at who we are as an organization. We've been at this now for 25 years. We're in our 25th year, which is really exciting. What's unique about RSG in this space is we never work for the vendors we cover in any way, shape, or form. You know, Tony will show the subway map here momentarily, but what makes us really different in this space is that our only focus is on technology, users, and buyers. We sit on your side of the table exclusively to make sure that you're getting the real story about what these vendors do well, but maybe more importantly, what they don't do well or where they might fall short for you. And so Tony's going to take us through today on marketing automation platforms and email service providers. So I'm going to kick things over to him, and I'll come back at the end of today's session. Tony?
Great. Thanks, Scott. So today we're going to be talking about what we call outbound marketing platforms, or sometimes outbound messaging platforms. And it's really important to clarify because that's really the heart and soul of what these platforms do. As you know, it's not just email, but typically it is mostly around messaging and primarily around outbound messaging, although the vendors have different ways of labeling themselves to sort of conceal that fact. But it's the green line on our subway map. This is the new 2026 subway map that shows all the different vendors that we follow, and the various lines represent the various technologies that those vendors sell or purport to sell. And you can see the green line here is pretty much like the other ones, that there's some vendors in the city center, and then a number on the periphery. So you have choices here about using some of your maybe incumbent larger vendors that have been around for a long time versus some other sometimes reasonably large vendors that are more sort of best of breed. So to that extent, it's very much like almost every other MarTech market. And it's interesting, I was reflecting that we haven't really blogged a lot or had a lot of webinars about outbound messaging platforms. And it's not because we haven't been working in this area. In fact, we've done a number of selection projects, and it's a big part of the sort of stack evaluations and stack reviews that we do. It just has felt like, to some extent, there's not always a lot new happening. Yes, some new vendors pop up. Yes, some new capabilities emerge. We're going to talk about CEPs here a little bit later in this context. So there's been some evolution, but not really necessarily anything earth-shattering. So I'm glad to have this time to spend with you now, because actually we do think that this particular segment is at a bit of an inflection point. And so we ought to talk about that and what it means for you, the enterprise MarTech leaders. So first, as always, when we look at any marketplace, we want to put it in context of your broader stack. And this is really important for setting the stage for anything, but particularly since it's been a while since we talked about outbound messaging, I think there's kind of an evolution of things that are going on around it that's super important here. Then, as always, we'll review the marketplace and then some critical decisions. And I think particularly the critical decision that you've come here today, which is, should you actually replace your incumbent platform? And we've definitely got some answers around that. And then finally, we always like to leave you with some key takeaways. So I would describe for the quarter century that we've been following this technology, I would say there's been kind of a like-hate relationship, definitely not a love-hate relationship, because it seems like nobody loves their incumbent outbound marketing platform. At best, they're sort of reasonably happy that it's better than the one that they used to have, but still, there's always been a lot of frustration here. Part of the frustration is I think we've kind of loaded them up with doing things that they don't naturally always want to do, and we've treated them too much like omnibus marketing platforms, and really they're just outbound messaging platforms. But there's always been a lot of frustration around authoring, the asset libraries, some of the logic, the complexities of the campaign building, challenges sometimes connecting with other outbound platforms as a coherent whole, the vendors sometimes not always being as responsive as you'd like. So, it's been, I would say that there's a kind of perpetual state of, gee, maybe I should leave my vendor. And you know what? Surveys have consistently shown this over the last 10 to 15 years. If you go back and look at all the different MarTech leadership surveys, the one thing that people say they would really like to replace next year, what's almost always one or two, is your outbound marketing platform, which is really interesting. Now, not everyone does actually pull the trigger on that, but there's kind of pandemic frustration in this space. And so the question is 2026 any different with respect to how you view this than maybe if we had done this a year ago? And I think the answer is yes. And you can guess why the answer is yes, but it turns out there's a little bit more to it than that. So let's start with our reference architecture. This is our B2C reference architecture. The B2B, as we'll see, is only a little bit different, but you've probably seen this before if you've come to our previous webinars. We use this a lot as just a point of reference for where MarTech stacks are going in this decade, that you have a profusion of engagement channels on the top, you've got various interaction delivery environments, and then the key thing that we've all been spending a lot of time, particularly in the 2010s, bulking up, is this first colored row of engagement services. And you can see outbound marketing there, which is really campaigns and messaging and offers and that sort of stuff, primarily email, but increasingly other message platforms too, like SMS, WhatsApp, even drop ship postcards, which have come back in vogue, outbound telephony, all this. The key thing is outbound. In the B2C world, we call it an ESP. In the B2B world, we call it a MAP, or marketing automation platform, but it's pretty much the same thing. Then you have customer foundation services, and we believe this is where the action is really moving to, which are channel independent ways of creating core capabilities in either the content and information pillar, the middle data pillar, or the far right decisioning pillar. And that this is increasingly an essential strategy that you need to take going forward to deal with an omni-channel future and an AI future. So we call this architecture kind of loosely coupled and strongly backed, where more complexity people and budget are moving to these core customer foundation services. We think this is the only way to speed and scale. It's the only way to omni-channel. It's the only way to do effective AI, because AI platforms really want you to have this foundation of core data, core content, and some decisioning to plug into or to supplement. And so this is really the future. It's already happening now among forward-looking enterprises. And the interesting thing is that when you look at that, it used to be back in the early days, kind of like your website and your email platform were sort of like the two prime engagement environments. But now if we look at this, it's really just one colored box among many. So your outbound marketing platform is still important, but it has become, I would say, relatively less important with each passing year. That doesn't mean it's unimportant. And definitely these rumors of the death of email have always been exaggerated. But the reality is it is less and less of your stack in a relative term. And so we ought to treat it that way too, whether it's B2C ESP or B2B MAP platform. Okay. The other big thing that's happening, and this is happening more slowly, is on the decisioning side. So, a lot of you are doing some really good work around data. Some of you are moving towards more omni-channel content platforms. That's great. On the decisioning side of this whole, that's the sort of third far right pillar, we see a trend where enterprises are going to transition from campaigns to journeys. So journeys are more phase-based. They're less about provoking and channeling and more about listening and responding. They're much more customer-centric. They put the customer at the center of the engagement, and they incorporate omni-channel touch points. This is important because almost all the so-called journey builders that you see out there are really just multi-channel outbound and not omni-channel. Omni-channel would also include inbound and third-party intermediaries and paid media as well. And so this transition has been is a difficult one. Certainly, this sort of campaign mindset has a big grip on us. Journeys are maybe a little bit more intimidating. True journeys can still hold campaigns. So journeys often have campaigns. It's just that the campaigns are very state or status specific, right? State or phase specific. So there's this mindset shift that's going on as well. That's also kind of, I think, making the whole notion of outbound marketing platforms all that more esoteric, right? They used to be your marketing database. Now we're moving those to CDPs or some other equivalent. They used to be the principal palette that you would decide how to interact with someone, and now we're moving from these kind of provoke and channel campaigns to these more listen and respond journeys. So they're less and less relevant, the services, each passing year, with the exception of the one key service, which is they actually deliver a message somehow. So there's always still that message delivery function. Now, like every other MarTech vendor, all your ESPs and MAPs are saying that they're AI enabled now, and more so and more agentic, you know, with each passing month. That's just as good as it goes. Hopefully you're not paying extra for that. In the future, you may have to. We tend to think that popping up and all these different AI services, lighting up all these AI services within this top engagement tier, that's fine for testing. In the long run, it's not going to be the winning architecture. The winning architecture is going to be able to plug in channel neutral or channel independent insights and decisioning and generative AI services into all of your different platforms. This is the way, this provides a much more coherent customer system, and it's the only way to scale, and it's the only way to do this cost effectively, and it's the only way to really do responsible AI, which are those 6 key blue boxes on the left, rather than applying them to 100 different AI services across the rest of your stack. And then, of course, agentic AI, kind of slow to emerge, but it will become increasingly important. And so the idea is that these AI capabilities live above your foundational platforms and help make them more automated and more effective, as opposed to living at your engagement tier. This too is going to be a longer term transformation, but it's really the only way that you're going to be able to scale and to scale cost effectively. So that's just some context about where the world is going. Now let's talk about the marketplace as it is today. So when you look at outbound marketing, and again, you could say outbound messaging, because that's really what these guys are doing, it kind of falls into 3 buckets. So you have B2C oriented email service providers, and you can divide those into some of the more legacy players. You could argue some are more legacy than others, but they're mostly legacy players who tend to have older architectures and often tend to have higher costs too. Not always, but often. Then you have some more modern players that have cropped up mostly in the last decade or so. You'll recognize those names, but they're still fundamentally really ESPs. And then some lower end and newsletter oriented. In each one of these boxes, you could probably add some more vendor logos, but I think you get the idea. Then underneath that, B2B oriented marketing automation platforms, you know, these are almost all legacy platforms, which is really interesting and tells us something about the map space. Yeah, there's some newer vendors that show up from time to time. It's not clear which ones of them get critical mass. A lot of them are competing on price, but it's interesting to watch this space in particular kind of age. And I think the thing about marketing automation platforms is they were designed to be sort of a B2B stack in a box, and it didn't really quite turn out that way. Really, the reason why people hang on to them is because they have really good integration with Salesforce CRM. And that's the thing that sort of people are clutching onto. Some have better integration than others, but you get the idea. The most interesting segment in this space going forward, it might surprise you, and that's a 3rd group of programmatic senders on the right. So these are basically vendors that, for the most part, you work with them through an API. Most, if not all of you, are already using one of these for your transactional messages, where they tend to work very, very well. It turns out that model, as we look going forward, might turn out to be kind of the winning model with respect to actual message execution. As we remove other services from an ESP and MAP, somebody still has to deliver the email, somebody still has to deliver the SMS, the WhatsApp message, that maybe even the packet that goes to your mail house. And so programmatic senders are going to be useful in that respect, but they're going to be a very low cost way and very highly efficient way of doing it and highly speedy way of doing that. And so that's good. Now, I've been talking about primarily large enterprise or enterprise and large enterprise scenarios in particular when we look at this kind of composable stack. In the mid-market, there is this concept of a customer engagement platform, or CEP, which is a kind of which is a sort of MarTech stack in a box. It's a box set of services. Usually outbound marketing is the strongest service that they have. These all tend to be newer firms. They will occasionally have a low-end client. They will occasionally have a large enterprise, but for the most part, they're targeting mid-market firms that have smaller staff. And so they need a box set of services all integrated into one piece and not best of breed. Now, not all CEP vendors have all of these services. We've recently published some research from my colleague Apoorv about this particular marketplace, evaluating 14 vendors, looking at the pros and cons. It's generally a somewhat immature marketplace, but still is an important kind of subsegment of this outbound messaging world, in as much as outbound messaging is a big part of any CEP, but they also do a lot more and they want to do a lot more. So if you're a larger enterprise, you probably want to step away. If you're a mid-market firm, this could be a very appealing choice. Now we get to really try to answer that question that we posed at the beginning of this webinar. What does this all mean in terms of what should you do with the ESP or the MAP that you sit somewhere on the spectrum from like to hate? So what do you do? And let's assume for a moment that you're unhappy with your incumbent. So let's start over on the left. Again, I'm going to make a distinction between mid-market business and large enterprise. So the classic designation here is kind of employee-based. At a mid-market business might be 50 or 100 to 1,000 employees. That's a pretty big range. There's definitely an upper mid-market tier that says you've got more than 500 employees and you're a knowledge firm, or you're very digitally focused, or you're a digital native. That kind of actually puts you into the enterprise tier, right? But if you're 1,000 employees and 920 of them are warehouse workers, and you've got a marketing team of 2 people, that's definitely mid-market, right? So there's some discernment that has to go on here. And we've done some interesting work with enterprises, helping them figure out where they land. And in many cases, we've discerned that the enterprise truly has mid-market capabilities and mid-market needs, and then we've helped them pick a CEP. So that's great. And if that's you, happy to talk with you. But then there's the issue of the upper mid-market or large enterprise. And I'm going to take 2 extreme choices that you have here. So the first choice, which is at some level maybe a happier choice, is, look, you can get by with your incumbent for the next 1 to 3 years, let's say, and so they're good enough. It's not a burning house situation, and you've been working on your core. So you've got a robust customer data ecosystem with ambitious AI strategies. You've been componentizing your core customer content, including the content that you'll be putting into messages, and you can begin to build decisioning services atop either your existing CDP or some journey orchestration or some other decisioning services. And so if that resembles you, then the advice that we would say is, hey, continue to decouple and then decommission your ESP and your MAP. So you slowly decouple services like content and data management from your ESP and MAP. You manage those at a lower level. You start planning to build campaigns elsewhere. And then you begin to transition email and then other message senders to programmatic senders, where you're just doing this through an API. Then you sit back and enjoy the late 20s, because you're going to be ahead of most of your peers. And on the next slide, I'll show you a little bit more about how this exactly works. But this is a happy story. It's not an easy story, but there's definitely a happy outcome. The second extreme is really the opposite, that you have largely not built out your core foundational services, that you're doing a lot of core services at the edge within your ESP or your MAP. A lot of your data and content resides there, it's stuck there. But on the other hand, you have pressing business need to switch platforms. You have a burning platform, right? and you're okay with switching it to a similar but more modern and better platform that's going to live for 5 to 8 years until you end up going to option 1. At some point, all of us are going to option 1. It's just a question where. In other words, the ESP and the MAP market will die. It's just a question of when. And it could be a while. And there's going to be a long spectrum between those who basically chuck it sooner and those who end up chucking it later. And it's okay if you're one of those who's going to be chucking it later. In fact, I think more of you probably fall into category 2 than category 1. And so you're okay with swapping out your existing ESP for a modern and more better fitting ESP over the 5 to 8 year lifespan. You might also go this route if outbound messaging is unusually important as a marketing motion. In other words, it's like maybe your principal marketing motion, for better or worse. And so, maybe even dwarfing paid media. And if that's the case, then this is really important that you get this right. And so maybe switching, replacing and downshifting is the way to go. So by replacing, we mean perform an agile selection process for a replacement platform, which agile, we mean test-based, empirical, wrote a whole book on that. Happy to help you in your selection process. But you only want to consider more modern platforms. Some lower end or new entrants could also be plausible, but what you want to avoid is this silo trap that you may be in already. In other words, plan for the future by not relying on your outbound platform as being kind of a source of the truth for data, for content, and maybe even certain other messaging attributes. In other words, you begin to sort of do this decoupling even while you're relying on more of a heavy duty platform. So 1 and 2 are extremes. Most of you will fall somewhere kind of in between, although a lot of you might lean towards path 2. Again, this is an area where we've done a lot of discernment with our clients to sort of help them figure out, okay, where are we? If we mix our situations together, what should our strategy be? Should we decouple and decommission it, or should we replace sooner rather than later? A lot of this, of course, has to do with your contract timing. And I neglected to mention on that initial slide that one of the reasons why we don't leave our ESPs and MAPs, even though we'd like to, is because it's one of the harder migration challenges, and it can take often 9 months to a year, sometimes longer, to move from one platform to another, and that sometimes tends to, kind of stay your hand a little bit, for better or worse. So definitely it has to be an intentional choice. But let's talk about option 1, because again, eventually you're all getting there. It's just a question of when. And the interesting thing is, I can confirm that we know of enterprises, and we have helped enterprises do this today. So I'm not talking about some future nirvana. But what I am going to show you is kind of a future reference model. So what does this mean in terms of decoupling and decommissioning? So once again, we have these 3 pillars that are turned on its side. You've got some sort of omni-channel content platform where you've got your core content blocks, product information, image and media assets, variants and derivatives. It's all livened up by Gen AI. You have your customer data ecosystem, which may or may not reside in a CDP, but there's other capabilities where you've got the authoritative customer profile, you can build customer segments, you've got propensity values and action triggers, all this improved by Insights AI. Then you have some sort of decisioning capabilities or decisioning layer, and sometimes that can actually be embedded into a CDP, sometimes it's independent, where you're determining things like NSPEC experience, and you're doing some contextual optimization, and that's where a lot of the big wins come from, is optimizing the experience based on the context that the customer is presenting. And that, of course, is improved by decisioning AI, and then in the future, not necessarily in 2026, but in the future, agentic AI is going to be kind of orchestrating a lot of this and sending this all down through the stream via an API to a programmatic sender. And so we'll just imagine for ourselves over on the right that this is an email. It doesn't have to be an email. It could be a much simpler WhatsApp message or Facebook message or what have you. But it's got a title 1, it's got a block 1 and a block 2. Maybe the algorithm says that we should move up block 2 for you and move down block 1 for someone else. And then it's got maybe a series of other choices as part of a carousel believes that, and then something very personalized, last chance, and then some agent readable structured content. So we are living in a world of agent experience optimization. There's a lot of debate about this, but it's already happening where there are customer agents that are filtering your email. So filtering people's email. So we have to assume that on the other side, and we have to be able to talk successfully to those agents, so that they first let you through the gate, and then second, assign the right values to you to what you're actually trying to convey. The goal here is that ultimately a human will be looking at this. It's just what context are they going to be looking at this? So this sounds very futuristic, but again, we know enterprises that have transitioned over the over the past several years to this model. There are companies doing this today, maybe not as much AI inflected yet, although they're definitely well positioned to do that. But where they have content blocks, they've got very active, instead of spending money on their email platform, they're spending money, a lot of them, on decision science, and then assembling basically more or less one-to-one messages to millions of consumers, in some cases millions of consumers daily, and seeing dramatic improvements on the revenue side, sometimes as much as 25%. So again, this is the future. It's just a question of whether we're all going towards it. And again, this is really an enterprise future, right? In the mid-market, it's likely to be similar to this, but probably constructed a little bit more like a unified box. And so this is definitely something you should be moving towards, and I think some of you can begin to start doing this as soon as 2026, right? So we'll just wrap up with some key takeaways. So consider outbound marketing in a stack context, and your stack is going to need to change for the new era. There's going to be what we've called Pilates, which is building out your core. Everyone needs to do that. Smarter companies are already doing that very intentionally. And so you want to remove key services, content, and data from the edge, and your ESP and your map is the edge, one of your edges. You want to remain cautious about lighting up AI in your engagement vendors. This can lead to higher costs, higher risks, and lower value due to basically siloization, the same siloization problem that we have. I do understand that it's right there, it's prevalent, it may be free, there's no reason not to test it, but I don't think in the long run this is going to be the winning architecture for where AI and agentic AI is applied. You want to begin to prep for a world without ESPs and MAPs, but that world could be 5 to 8 years away for some of you, maybe longer. And so what you'll want to do is potentially switch horses in the meantime. And that's really what we're getting to in number 4, which is don't hesitate to replace your incumbent this year if it's a burning house. You can do better, so often cheaper in the market. You just need to choose wisely, and we can help you do that. And then, rethink engagement in the era of AI. Automation is going to change all of your motions. It's going to change a lot of customer behavior as well, both on the B2C and the B2B side. And the winning strategy here, we can't all predict exactly what that's going to look like, but we can know, I think, for 100% surety that those enterprises that focus on their core data, their core content, their core decisioning capabilities, they're going to win this future, and they're going to be the ones to be able to essentially replace the investment that they're making at the edge with higher level investment. So instead of paying someone to manage email campaigns, you're using that money towards better data science, or better content. So I wanted to remind you again that if you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to use the questions tab in the GoToWebinar, or also anything you disagree with, any anecdotes you'd like to share. It's all private, so feel free. We have time for a little bit of engagement there. Wanted to just remind you that Real Story Group can help you in any number of different ways. We can help you tune your AI strategy and tactics, help you optimize your stack with our with corporate memberships. You also belong to our council, our private MarTech Stack Leadership Council. We can learn from your peers. And as always, one of our core capabilities for the last 25 years is helping you select technology in an agile way. So I'll leave it to my colleague Scott to talk about next steps, and we'll see what questions or comments have come in the meantime.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tony. And if anyone has questions outside of today's webinar that they want to reach out to us on, you can use the coordinates here, explorerealstorygroup.com. Happy to share information with you regarding our corporate memberships and that Stack Leadership Council. We've got another exciting meeting coming up in late February, and we'll continue with our quarterly sessions as a group. Also, I do want to mention that Tony and my colleague Jared have been recording podcasts over the last several months. So if you go to our site, look at our podcast page, we've got 10 of them up right now that cover a wide range of MarTech related topics, and another one coming up next week. So stay tuned for that, and you can subscribe to those wherever you get your podcasts. Tony, I just want to see if you saw any questions come up on your side.
Yeah, James, I want to just say, I think James M, you put in a comment and we accidentally deleted it. So sorry for that. If you were asking a question or making a comment, I might invite you to put it back in. Steve is saying, great webinar, just a shame all this will take so long. Yeah, you're right, it is kind of a shame. Some organizations are going to move faster. I think, Steve, that what's going to push this a little bit faster is what's happening on the consumer side and less on the enterprise side. In other words, I think consumers are going to be adopting agents or agent-like technology faster than enterprise will, and it's going to call the question on our stack, and it's going to call the question on our core. And so we'll probably see a lot of urgent requests to go this direction. And my wish for you is to be ready to deal with those requests that are going to come from your board. Why can't we, why can't we talk to agents? Why can't we get by AI filters and all that kind of thing? Alex is saying, I fully agree that ASPs are dying, but I do not understand maps. Would you explain? Yeah, I think, Alex, that it's a kind of a paradox here. Thanks for that question. Because on the one hand, the maps have been older and less innovative and arguably more declining value than a lot of ESPs. But people tend to hang on to them, partly because they may not see any greater alternatives. I mean, you can go to Eloqua, from Eloqua to Marketo or back again, and Marketo is a little bit more modern, but there's this out of the frying pan into the fryer type situation that's going on there, with some exceptions. The big thing about marketing automation platforms is that they do, to the extent that the winning ones have focused very intently on integration with your Salesforce automation platforms. And so that kind of gives them a certain degree of lock-in, because in a B2B context, you have to have this intimacy between marketing and sales. Whether that intimacy is working well or not is a whole separate question. But in a world where that's kind of peer-to-peer integration, that matters a lot. In the future world, we're going to stop, hopefully, integrating at the edge with all these platforms that weren't designed to be integrated. And instead, we'll be integrated from the core to the edge. That's going to be the main integration. And in that world, you really no longer need a map, because Salesforce, let's say Salesforce is your CRM, it's getting all of its data from the core, not from the email platform, not from the website, not from a Salesforce JavaScript on your website. So under the new architectural model, the value that a map brings, which today is principally integration with Salesforce, the value that they bring is kind of no longer there, and you no longer need it. So I think maps will die out at probably the same pace, if not faster, than ESPs. That's I have to confess, though, that's just an educated guess. Okay, Drava is asking, what about Microsoft? I saw Microsoft Dynamics, and that's a great question. Microsoft Dynamics CRM, was acquired by Microsoft. Microsoft has kind of evolved it over the years and kind of taken it in different directions. They added, not once, but twice, a kind of a map layer. They kind of built the CDP behind it, quasi, but they've never really, it's never really taken off. I think partly because almost all their customers, not all of them, but the vast majority of their customers are mid-market customers. And honestly, the map hasn't seen a lot of uptake, but it's still there. It's still prevalent. I wouldn't necessarily license it afresh, but it's not like a lot of other maps. It's a legacy platform that's embedded, and its inherent value is the integration with Dynamics CRM for your Salesforce. So that's about it with Microsoft. It would be the same story with Oracle, by the way. Cool. Well, thanks, everyone. Always enjoy our time together. Sorry we ran a little bit late, but hope you got some value out of this. Really welcome your feedback and any kind of further dialogue that you'd like to talk about with respect to your own personal situation, because we find with respect to outbound marketing, it can be very enterprise specific. So happy to have that conversation with you. Here's the coordinates. But for now, we'll say so long. This is Tony Byrne and Scott Dill. See you next time.